Want to crush your opponent fast? Learn the deadly Nakhmanson Gambit. Sharp, aggressive, and perfect for surprise attacks. Let's dive in. Pawn to a4, pawn to a5, then knight to f3, knight to c6, and bishop to c4. This is the typical setup of the Italian game. Now black plays knight to f6. At this point, instead of going for knight to g5 or any of the usual lines, you strike with pawn to d4, directly challenging the center. If black captures the pawn with pawn takes d4, you don't recapture immediately. Instead, you calmly castle kingside. This puts black in an awkward position. If they ignore the threat, you can push pawn to a5 on the next move, kicking the knight and gaining extra tempi, while your pawn on d4 remains available to recapture whenever you're ready. But often, black sees the undefended pawn on e4 and decides to grab it with knight takes e4. Now, if you try a direct attack like queen to e2 or rook to e1, black usually feels safe with pawn to d5, reinforcing the knight and blocking the diagonal from your bishop. However, here comes the surprise. Instead of going for the obvious moves, you play the shocking and brilliant knight to c3, seemingly giving up a piece for nothing. This unexpected sacrifice tends to completely disorient unprepared opponents. Now black has a tempting choice. The most natural continuation is pawn takes c3, but let's look at the more correct-looking move first. Knight takes c3, you recapture with pawn takes c3, and again, black plays pawn to d5, gaining space and trying to shut down your bishop. But here, you strike with rook to e1, giving a check. Black blocks with bishop to e7, and then you calmly retreat the bishop to d3. If black now castles, trying to stay solid, you respond with knight takes d4, and suddenly your position is bursting with attacking potential. Let me know if you'd like the pawn takes c3 line explained too. Although computers generally suggest that black is fine in this position, it's actually uncomfortable for black to play. While black is up a pawn, it's not clear what they should do. On your side, you have an open file, two powerful bishops eyeing the board, and your queen ready to come out. Meanwhile, black can't develop their bishop to any active squares since all of them are under your control, leaving them in a position of uncertainty. Black might consider trading knights, but that doesn't solve the underlying problems. The most common move for black here is bishop to f6, trying to apply some pressure, but then you have a brilliant sequence. First, you play bishop to a3, developing the bishop and attacking the rook. After black moves the rook, you then bring your queen to h5, threatening queen takes h7 checkmate, supported by your bishop. Now, black responds with pawn to g6, thinking they are safe and covered. But out of nowhere, you play queen takes d5, and the game takes a sudden and unexpected turn. Your opponent clearly didn't see this coming. After they recapture with queen takes d5, you strike with rook takes e8, and suddenly black is in big trouble. That was the entire point of the earlier sacrifice. Now the black king has only one legal move, and your bishop, waiting in ambush, delivers final blow, a back-rank checkmate. In the next game, the position developed similarly. Black first captured on c3 and then played pawn to d5, attempting to close the diagonal. Your bishop retreated to d3, staying active and aiming at the king's side. This time, however, black got greedy and captured the pawn on c3, thinking there was no immediate threat. You continued with rook to e1 check. Black blocked the check with bishop to e7, and here you struck with knight to g5. Suddenly black faces new problems. Your knight on g5 and bishop on d3 both target the pawn on h7, and because of that pressure, black cannot easily castle. Black can't capture your knight either, as their bishop on a7 is pinned, so the most natural move they try is pawn to h6, hoping to kick out your knight and relieve the pressure. But instead of retreating, you sacrifice with knight takes f7. In the Nakhmanson Gambit, we don't back down. We press forward with fearless, aggressive play. Black accepts the sacrifice, but now comes queen to f3 check, and suddenly black is in serious trouble. As with many of these lines, the danger seems to appear out of nowhere, but becomes deadly in just a few moves. If the king tries to run back to g8 or e8, you respond with bishop to g6, and the black king is completely trapped. Then, you finish the game with queen to f7 checkmate. We're also putting pressure on long diagonal with our rook. Black is simply defenseless. In the actual game, black tried to defend, but we're not backing off. We continue the attack with queen to h5 check. Now, a new problem appears. Black must move the king, because if it were on g8, we would have the crushing move rook to e8, pinning the bishop and creating serious threats. So instead, you reinforce this idea with bishop to g6, still threatening rook to e8, and making it extremely difficult for black to respond. They attempt to block, but now comes the powerful and familiar idea. Bishop to a3. We've seen this idea in previous lines. This time it's even stronger. You're preparing to reroute the knight, and black is completely paralyzed. They try pawn to b6, aiming for pawn to c5 to block your bishop, but here comes the next sacrifice. Rook takes a 7. Now your bishop on a 3 protects the rook, and if black captures the rook, then your queen slides back to f3 with check. And here's the key. The bishop on e7 is pinned, so it can't move to block the check. The king is forced to move, and with that, you deliver the final blow. Queen to f7 checkmate. The next line is actually quite amusing, and you're very likely to encounter it in your own games if you start playing the Nakhmanson Gambit regularly. In this variation, black decides to immediately capture the pawn on c3, skipping any intermediate moves. At first glance, it looks perfectly fine for black. You respond with rook to a 1 check, and black blocks with bishop to e7. Now comes knight to g5, a familiar attacking idea. You're once again aiming to apply pressure and open lines toward the black king. But this time, the situation is slightly different. Your knight and bishop are both eyeing the pawn on f7, black, thinking all is well, simply castles kingside, assuming they've solved their problems. But now comes queen to h5, and things start falling apart. Your threatening queen takes h7 checkmate, and at the same time, you're attacking the pawn on f7 3 times. To the untrained eye, it looks like black can simply trade pieces and survive. So, they play bishop takes g5, trying to neutralize your knight. But now comes the devastating move. Bishop to g5. Suddenly, black is in serious trouble. The queen is trapped. It can't move to the e-file because of your rook on e1, and it can't escape via the f6 pawn because that pawn is pinned to the king. There are no squares left. At this point, after a bit of thinking, your opponent will likely realize the truth and resign. The queen is lost, and so is the game. Now let's look at the main line. When black accepts the knight sacrifice and captures it with their pawn. Here comes another shock. You play bishop takes f7, continuing the series of bold sacrifices and pulling the king out. After king takes f7, you respond with queen to d5 check. Now black must move the king. Most opponents will choose king to e8. King to e7 is not good because it's blocked the pieces. King to g6 loses instantly to queen takes knight with check. King to f6 is what engines suggest, but from a human perspective, it looks suicidal. So king to e8 is what you'll see most often. Now, instead of grabbing the pawn on c4, you play rook to e1, bringing more pressure and threatening future checks. Black usually tries to block, and then you play rook takes c4, activating your rook fully into the attack. Since castling is no longer an option, black may try rook to f8 to defend. But now you play bishop to g5, lining up everything, and on the next move, you're ready for rook to e1, bringing all your forces against the bishop and the exposed king. At this point, your main goal is to break through and checkmate. A very common mistake by black is playing rook to f7. It looks solid, but it actually fails. After rook takes a 7, black can't recapture with the rook, because that leads to checkmate in 1. If they instead recapture with the knight, you continue with the strong move knight to g5, a recurring idea in this gambit. Now you're threatening the rook, and all rook to f7 really did was give you an extra tempo to activate your knight. Black often tries to return the rook to f8 to defend against the threat of queen to g8 checkmate, but now you play rook to e1, setting up a perfect attack. All your pieces are aiming at the king. In desperation, black may push their b2 pawn, trying to create counterplay or distract you. You must be careful not to allow it to promote, but the attack is already decisive. There are several ways to finish. In the actual game, queen to e5 was played. Another strong option is knight takes h7, creating multiple threats, including queen to h5, check and pressure on the rook. And if black once again plays rook to f7, you strike with rook takes e7, and after rook recaptures, you end the game with the final blow. Queen to g8 checkmate.